Hey, welcome back. And if you're new here, my name's Christina Kent, and I'm a fine artist based out of San Francisco. In this video, I want to do sort of a follow-up video to one that I posted a couple weeks ago on color temperature. So in that video, I showed an exercise for how we could use color temperature to impact the mood of our paintings, and I also introduced the concept of color temperature. And in this video, I wanted to give you some rules of thumb on how to apply color temperature to your paintings. So if you're interested in using this idea of color temperature, but if you're still kind of confused when it actually comes to applying it to your work, this video is for you. I'm going to share some rules of thumb that have worked really well in my work and show you some examples. And then I'm also going to show you one of my favorite tools for exploring this further. And just as a quick note, this video isn't sponsored by anyone, but if you'd like to support my work, you can purchase my paintings through my website, you can join my Patreon, or you can like, comment, subscribe to this channel. All these things really help. Okay, so maybe you're familiar with the concept of color temperature. Maybe you saw my other video. You're familiar with this idea that there are these warmer colors and cooler colors and that you can use that to impact your paintings, but you're not sure how to actually apply it. And I just want to caveat this video by saying that these are the things I'm talking about today are things that I found really work well in my work, but I didn't go to art school. These are things that I've just figured out work well for me over time. And also, I think if people try to tell you, hey, there's a right way to do this and there's a wrong way to do this, in art, I'm always skeptical of that. I think rules can be helpful, but sometimes they can also hold us back. So what I would say is everything that I say today, give it a try it out in your own work. And if it's helpful to you, keep it. If it's not, throw it out. Okay, so let's say we're looking to paint a scene. I'm assuming that we're painting a realistic scene and we're using fairly naturalistic colors, like a lot of the work that I do. So maybe you going out to do some plein air painting, you're going out in your neighborhood or out into nature, and you want to figure out how can you use color temperature in the painting. So the first question I usually ask is, what is the lighting situation? Are you working with direct sunlight? Are you working with indirect sunlight? Or maybe you're indoors and you're using some artificial light. This is really important. So I've noticed that there are general rules of thumb for color temperature that are applied differently in these different situations. So usually I found that in situations where there's direct sunlight, it often helps. I feel like the painting seems stronger if I push the areas that are in light to be a bit warmer, so a bit more towards orange. And if I push the areas that are in shadow to be a bit cooler, a bit more towards blue. The way I think about this is that the shadows, the areas that are in shadow, they're actually getting a lot of that reflected daylight coming in, like reflected light from the sky. So they tend to be a bit bluer. This is how I explain it to myself. I don't know the science actually, but this is what makes sense to me. So I notice that on days when it's bright and sunny, it helps my painting if I push the shadows to be a little bit cooler and the lights to be a little bit warmer. I think a great example of this can be seen in Joaquin Sorolla's work. He is famous for painting people outside on the beach, so working with lots of strong, warm light. And in this painting, you can see how the light on their clothes looks a little bit warm. It's a very neutral highlight, the white on the dresses, but I see a little tint of yellow in that color. And then definitely in the shadows, they look very cool. So we see lots of blues, lots of cooler tones in the shadows, especially on the women's dresses. We can also see it in this watercolor painting by John Singer Sargent. Looks like it's a bright sunny day and you can feel the warmth and the highlights on the bridge and on the buildings, while the parts that are in shadow take on this cooler kind of bluish purpley tone. Here's an example of how I use it in my own work, and I think it's a lot more apparent when you see the painting in person, but there's in like the white that's on the door of the garage of this house, there's a little bit of yellow mixed in, a little bit of warmth, and then definitely you can see in the shadows, there are these very cool deep blues. Now, this is flipped if I'm painting outside, but I'm painting something in indirect sunlight. So say I'm painting someone sitting in the shade, then the lightest parts of that person are going to be getting that indirect sunlight. So I feel like the lights tend to be a little bit cooler. And then I can kind of push that by making the shadows a little bit warmer. I think this painting by Claude Monet is a fabulous example. So most of the figure is in shadow, and you can see that lots of beautiful blues and pinks and cool colors on her dress. But then if you look at the darkest shadows, like the crease of her dress here, you can see that it's actually kind of this warm brown, and it just creates a really beautiful contrast against those cooler grays. This also applies to if you're painting a still life inside or you're painting an interior scene that doesn't have artificial light, but it's just getting indirect sunlight. Then also, I'll usually notice that the lights tend to be cooler, and then I can kind of emphasize that by making the shadows a little bit warmer. We see an example of this in this painting by Vermeer. Vermeer was such a master of light, one of my favorite painters ever. And in this painting, you can see how there's this cool light coming in from the day, but then there are these warm shadows that are creating that contrast. And especially if we zoom in and look close at the figure's face, we can really get a sense of that cooler light hitting one side of her face and then those warm shadows on the other side. Here's an example by John Singer Sargent. And so we have this figure sitting in a room. It's getting indirect cool daylight coming in. And I love just zooming in and looking at the creases of her dress and seeing that play of the lighter, cool light against those beautiful warm shadows. The highlights of that shiny material of her dress are almost this icy blue color, and then the shadows move towards more towards green, towards brown, even a little bit towards orange. And here's an example in my own work of doing a still life with indirect lighting. And here I'm using the cool highlights on the oranges and on the wall behind them to really contrast against the warm color of the oranges themselves and their shadows. But what if you aren't working with natural light? What if you're working with an artificial light source? So for an artificial light source, I usually like to look and see if I can tell the temperature of the light. Some lights, especially like street lamps or incandescent light bulbs, they already have this warmer glow. If you look at them, you can tell they seem really warm, versus some fluorescent lights can be very cold. So when I'm working with artificial light, especially if I'm doing, say, a nighttime scene, I'll try to tell, is it a warm light or is it a cool light? And then I'll adjust the shadows to be a contrasting temperature. I think this painting by Degas is a great example of color temperature contrast in artificial light. So here we have this warm artificial light that's illuminating the dancer from below, and then we have these cooler grays in the shadows on her arms and her body. The painting Nighthawks by Edward Hopper is also a great example. We have the warm light inside the bar that's contrasted against these deep saturated blues in the background. And also if we look at the bartender's clothing, it looks like there's warm light hitting his shoulders, while the shadows are also more of those very saturated blues. Here's an example from my own work. So I was painting a restaurant. The interior had this warm lighting, and then it had this very dark exterior. And when mixing the blacks for the exterior, I really used a lot of blue so that that coolness would come through and contrast against the warmth inside. This other painting of mine was sort of the opposite effect. So there was this corner store that had very cool fluorescent lighting inside. And so when painting the darks, I used a very warm brown to contrast against that. Now, these are just helpful things you can try in your work. They're by no means hard, fast rules. And I would say too, like there's a lot of great paintings where they don't use this contrasting color temperature, where you have warm lights and warm shadows, or cool lights and cool shadows. That can totally work and make for fantastic paintings. I think that the best way to figure this out is through experimentation. So now I want to talk to you about my favorite way to experiment with this before I even start painting. Now you can experiment with this on the painting itself, but I usually like to prepare my reference image as much as I can before I actually get to the painting process. So a few years ago, I realized that a lot of photo editing software actually allows you to adjust the color temperature of your lights and shadows. And it's gonna be really helpful when we're planning our paintings. I usually like to do this in Procreate, but Photoshop has this feature as well. And I think a lot of photo editing software has this. So in Procreate, you can go into the adjustments and click color balance. And then it gives you the option to adjust the color balance for the highlights, the midtones, and the shadows. So sometimes we can try pushing the highlights to be warmer and the shadows to be cooler, or we can also see what happens if we make the shadows warmer and the highlights cooler. I think it's fun to play around with these options and see what impacts these effects have. So these are just some ideas of how you can start to really explore color temperature in your work. I hope this gave you some helpful things that you can try out. And let me know if you do try these things and what you think of them in the comments below. Or if you like to use color temperature in a different way in your work, I'd love to hear that too. Anyway, that's all I have for today. I hope you liked this video. If you did like it, please like the video, subscribe to my channel. This really helps me out. And as always, a huge shout out to my supporters on Patreon. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much for supporting my channel and making these videos happen. If you like my art, if you like my videos, and you want to help me make more, check out my Patreon at the link. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. And just as a quick note, I'm super excited to share that I recently launched a new portrait painting course on my website. In this course, we take the portrait and we break it down into simple light and shadow shapes. So if you want to see the step-by-step, real-time process for my portrait painting, be sure to check that out.